Hey guys, it's Max from Max Tech. In this video, I'll be sharing my experience moving from the latest spec'd out MacBook Pro to an old MacBook Air and seeing if it's usable in 2019. I'll share some surprising finds, some big downsides, and some tips to improve performance if you have an old Mac. Now this experience started when I was at a Best Buy and saw a salesperson suggesting someone the base MacBook Air from 2017, which they were still selling for $1,000, meaning that people are still buying them. I would never suggest a new one for that price, but I know that there's people out there looking for used Macs at around $400 to maybe $500, so I decided to take a look and see if it's worth it. Let's jump right in and start with my first experience, which was plugging in the Mac to charge up the dead battery. I was never as huge of a fan of MagSafe like some other reviewers, but there definitely is a satisfying click when the two magnets snap together that you cannot replicate with USB Type-C. The other handy feature is the LED light that lets you know when you're charging. I love the look of the new MacBooks, but dang, this thing really brings you back. There's just something special about that glowing Apple logo that elevates the Mac experience, at least if you're an Apple fan, that is. Opening up the Mac, you can't help but notice that huge silver bezel that jumps right out. It is massive, but for some reason the aluminum helps make it less annoying looking compared to Windows laptops with huge black plastic bezels. One thing that surprised me was the size. Now it's not large or thick or heavy, but it is noticeably larger compared to the new 13-inch MacBook Air or Pro. With that said, if you're buying a used one, you'll be very happy with the thin and light design. Now on to the biggest disappointment that I was expecting and also kind of dreading ahead of time, the display. Pressing down the power button to resurrect this Mac resulted in a soft image with colors that looked a bit off compared to the same image on my new Mac. Of course, Touch ID isn't available, so I logged in the old-fashioned way and was greeted with the High Sierra desktop. To be honest, the wallpaper looked terrible, and watching our own YouTube videos looked worse than I've ever seen them before, and reading text on websites was painful. With that said, if you haven't owned a high-res display before, you likely won't notice as huge of a difference as I did, but the 1400 by 900 screen will definitely look worse than your phone. The biggest problem, which is probably worse than sharpness, is color accuracy. I immediately noticed that photos and videos just didn't look quite right, and that's because compared to the new DCI-P3 displays in most iPads, iPhones, and Macs, this display can't even show 60% of sRGB, meaning you're missing from between 40 to 70% of actual realistic real-world colors. Because of this, even though I will be talking about photo and video editing in just a bit, if you do any kind of color editing that is important, I would look elsewhere. My MacBook Air only comes with a 1.6 GHz dual-core i5 processor and 4 GB of RAM, but thankfully Apple still offers macOS updates all the way back to 2012 Macs, and Apple's newer operating systems have improved performance and efficiency. So the first thing I did was upgrade to the just released macOS Catalina to get the best performance out of this old MacBook Air. I would highly recommend updating, but before you do, you need to make sure that you have enough space and that you're not relying on 32-bit versions of apps that are no longer supported to maximize efficiency. Thankfully, our sponsor for this video, Clean My Mac X, will help you do just that and a lot more. Clean My Mac X will search and delete those unsupported 32-bit apps the right way with no leftover files, and the updater feature will make sure you get the replacements when they're available. If your current Mac is feeling a bit sluggish, Clean My Mac X's dozen of cleanup and tune-up tools will help you speed up your Mac, remove malware and adware, clean your system junk files and hidden clutter, and build an interactive map of your Mac storage. Clean My Mac X is super easy to use and removes over 30 gigs of junk from the average user's Mac while speeding it up, so why not give it a try by clicking the link down in the video description. Now, with the MacBook Air in tip-top shape software-wise, it was time to put it to the test and see how it handles my normal workload. Loading up web pages was noticeably slower than my new Mac, but definitely usable. If you only have 4 gigs of system RAM, and maybe even if you have 8, and you also need to have a bunch of tabs open like I do, I would suggest looking at Safari instead of Chrome because it runs smoother and uses less memory and will run faster. When having a typical workload of about 10 tabs, Catalina was doing a great job of making everything work. It wrote about 1.8 gigs of files to the fairly fast SSD and was using about 3.3 gigabytes of RAM, with a lot of it being compressed. With about 10 tabs open, I did notice some extra lag when scrolling that wasn't there if I had 6 to 7 tabs open, and this is without any other major apps running. So if you're a tab junkie, you'll need at least 8 gigs of RAM or some major patience. Navigating around was surprisingly good, even though this old trackpad isn't the super cool adjustable force touch design. It's large, smooth, and responsive, so most people will be very happy with it. Now the keyboard was a different experience. I spent a lot of my day typing, so I thought I might actually love the old chiclet design, which has about 3 times the key travel, but to be honest, I didn't. Yes, the key travel does feel better, but because the keys themselves are smaller with bigger spacing between the keys, my typing accuracy went down. Reliability isn't a problem with these old keyboards, which is an upside, but I prefer to type on the latest version of the butterfly keyboard. Backlighting was also distracting at night with light spilled all around the keys, but if you're coming from a different laptop, you'll likely have the same kind or maybe no backlighting at all. Behind these keys, we have hidden speakers, and the volume surprised me. We've been testing different Windows laptops lately, like the 2019 XPS 2-in-1, and even though that is over $2,000 when spec'd out, the speakers are a fair bit quieter than this old MacBooks. The sound quality was noticeably worse than the new MacBooks, but for usability when listening to music, podcasts, or watching videos, the loudspeakers are surprisingly capable. Another surprisingly usable part of this system is the I/O, which actually I guess isn't too surprising. All of the new Macs use only USB Type-C, which works fine for me most of the time, and I don't have to use dongles too often, but for somebody that edits photos and videos all the time, having that SD card slot is just so nice. We also have 2 USB Type-A ports and a single Thunderbolt 2 port, which is enough for most people. Now, if you don't need that SD card slot, it can be easily used to cheaply expand the internal SSD with these flush mount SD cards. These aren't super fast, but they'll do a good job for photos, videos, and other files if you're like me and have a MacBook Air that has 128 gigs of SSD space. This is something that you can't really pull off well with the new MacBook. And another thing a new MacBook can't do is to be able to swap out the SSD after you buy it, since everything is soldered in. The stock 128GB SSD is surprisingly fast, but if you really want to get serious with your storage, you can actually upgrade to a larger and faster NVMe SSD drive to speed things up. Not many people know that up from 2015, which is my model, and on, they actually had a 4x M.2 slot. You just need a little cheap adapter to be able to use ultra fast and affordable SSDs. I'll go ahead and leave a link to one down in the video description. Now, my battery life was surprisingly good with about 7 hours of average use because this battery is in pretty good condition. But if your MacBook is dying fast, you can actually swap out the battery in a matter of minutes with around a $40 to $50 third-party battery pack. Now, the last thing we need to take a deeper dive on is the performance. Looking at raw power in Geekbench 4, we have a multi-core score of 5,800, which is actually slower than an iPhone 7 or the base model $329 iPad. This fairly low performance is mainly because the dual-core CPU is a 5th generation, and that's even for the 2017 model as well, whereas new Windows laptops are shipping with 10th gen Intel CPUs. For normal use like email, web browsing, and watching videos, the performance is good enough, and optimized Apple apps work decently well. As I mentioned previously, the display isn't up to par for color critical work, but if you're interested in some simple photo editing, I would highly recommend the new optimized and updated Photos app. I edited a variety of RAW and JPEG images, and while at times there was some delay when using sliders and swapping photos, the experience was definitely usable. Based on what I saw there though, I would highly avoid using Lightroom and other heavier apps. The main slowdown was likely because of the 4 gigs of RAM, so I would suggest closing everything in the background when editing photos or videos. This is something that Clean My Mac X can help you do really easily, so make sure to check out the link below to speed up your Mac. Now on to video editing. The latest version of Final Cut has some optimizations, but even still 4K video editing is really slow and choppy. And if you want to edit HEVC files from your iPhone or GoPro, they literally will not play because the old processor can't handle them. It literally just kind of pauses and doesn't play. 1080p and 720p video is definitely possible, so if you want to cut together some simple videos, Final Cut or iMovie will do just fine. So what did I learn overall from this experience, and would I suggest buying something else instead? Well, first off, do not let yourself, or anybody else for that matter, buy one of these for $1,000 at Best Buy. But if you're thinking about spending somewhere around $400 on Craigslist, this laptop could do a better job at regular tasks than I expected. Make sure to have the latest software and use optimized apps like Safari, and it will do a surprisingly good job for these basic things and for an internet machine, which will offer you long-lasting battery life, decent speakers, and a good keyboard and trackpad. The other thing I learned is that modern heavier apps and tasks really push this machine to its limits and beyond at this point. So if you want to edit photos or videos on a laptop, you'll want to step up to a 2018 Air or maybe a 2019 base MacBook Pro, which will cost not that much more money, especially if you're looking at new deals and then those have sales on them, and that will run a lot faster. But you'll also have a much better experience with a nice display that can actually show you all of the colors. Let me know what your experience is like if you're using an old Mac, and if you check out Clean My Mac X by using a link down below, let me know how much it helped to clean up your system and speed it up as well. Click above to subscribe and down below to enable notifications, and if you want to see another video, we have a couple great ones right over there. This has been Max Tech, and I will see you in the next one.